Hey, welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy tonight's stories. Here we venture into the dark web, peeling back layers of mystery and terror to reveal tales that were never meant to be told. Leave a like and subscribe for more dark web scary stories.
I work in a remote government lab. The dark web claims we're experimenting on humans. Last week, one of the subjects tried to warn me. I didn't start out in this job thinking I'd end up questioning reality. Honestly, I took it because the pay was ridiculous and my life was going nowhere fast. I wasn't exactly qualified for anything special. College dropout, no real experience, but I was good at keeping my mouth shut. That's pretty much all they wanted when I applied for the position. The listing was vague. Remote facility support staff. Security clearance required. $80,000 annually. I thought it was a scam at first, but the interview felt legit, even if the questions were strange. Are you willing to work in isolation for extended periods? Yes. Can you follow protocols without question? Sure. What's your stance on confidentiality? I laughed awkwardly. I'm great at keeping secrets. Apparently that was the right answer, because a week later, I was flown out to the middle of nowhere. I mean that literally. No towns, no landmarks, just endless desert. The facility looked like a bunker straight out of a conspiracy theory, with a giant metal door that slid open when I arrived. No one introduced themselves. The people there didn't wear name tags, and they talked to me like I was just another cog in the machine. My job was straightforward: basic maintenance, logging data, and occasionally walking through some of the facility's lower levels to check for anomalies, whatever that meant. At first it seemed normal enough, boring even. But then, after a couple of weeks, I started noticing things. One of my tasks was to deliver reports to a room labeled Section D-8. It was one of the restricted areas, but I was allowed access as long as I didn't linger. They were very specific about that. Deliver the report and leave immediately. The first time I went there, I couldn't help but glance around. The hallways were sterile and bright, lined with doors that had thick, reinforced windows. Most of them were dark, but a few had dim lights inside. I couldn't see much, just shadows, like someone or something was sitting in the corner, watching. I dropped the report in the designated slot and hurried out, trying to ignore the way the air felt heavier in that part of the lab. It was like the walls were pressing in, like the whole section was alive and didn't want me there. Things started getting weirder after I stumbled across a video online. It was late, and I was scrolling mindlessly on my laptop in the staff quarters. My connection was restricted to an internal network, but I'd found a workaround to access the outside internet. Nothing too illegal, just enough to keep me sane. That's when I found a thread on a forum about government conspiracies. The title caught my eye immediately. Remote Desert Facility, Experimenting on Humans. Evidence inside. It didn't mention my workplace specifically, but the description was unsettlingly close. A high-security lab, secretive staff, strange noises reported by nearby locals. Not that there were any locals for miles around us. Most of the comments were typical conspiracy junk. They're making super soldiers, or this is where they keep aliens. But one stood out. Not aliens, not soldiers. They're experimenting on people. My brother worked there before he disappeared. He told me they were testing on volunteers. Said they weren't volunteers for long. If you're reading this, get out. The post was old, and the account that posted it had been deleted. I tried to shrug it off, but it gnawed at me. I knew I shouldn't dig deeper, but curiosity got the better of me. I clicked the link in the post, which led to a page on the dark web. The site was bare bones, just a black background with a single video embedded in the center. I hesitated before hitting play. The video was grainy, like it had been filmed with a hidden camera. It showed a room that looked eerily familiar. One of the rooms in section D-8. There was a man sitting on the floor, shirtless, his back to the camera. His body was covered in scars, some of them fresh, others old and puckered. He was rocking back and forth, muttering something I couldn't make out. Then he turned to face the camera. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and filled with terror. He pressed his face close to the lens, and for a moment, I thought he was looking directly at me. "They're lying to you," he whispered. "It's not for science. It's not for the greater good. They're not letting anyone out." The video cut off abruptly, leaving me staring at the blank screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was fake, that someone had staged it to freak people out. But the room in the video wasn't just similar to section D8. It was exactly the same. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the video. Every time I passed through section D8, I felt like someone or something was watching me. The shadows behind the reinforced windows seemed darker, and once I swore I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned, the room was empty. That night, I heard the first knock. It was faint, barely audible, like someone was tapping on the door to my quarters. I opened it, expecting to find one of the other staff members. The hallway was empty. I closed the door and locked it, telling myself it was just the pipes or the ventilation system. But as I lay in bed, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't open the door again. Instead, I turned off the light and pressed my ear to the cold metal, straining to hear anything else. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then from somewhere down the hall, I heard a voice. "Help me." It was faint, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It wasn't the voice of any staff member I recognized. It was hoarse and desperate, like whoever it belonged to had been screaming for hours. I stayed awake all night, staring at the door, waiting for the knocks to come back. They didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't gone. The next day, I made a decision. I was going to find out what was really happening in this place, even if it killed me. The morning after the knocking, everything felt different. The air in the facility seemed heavier, like the walls were holding in more than just the usual hum of machinery. The staff moved through the halls like shadows, avoiding eye contact and keeping conversations to one or two clipped sentences. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice I'd heard. Help me. It was impossible to ignore. Every creak of the vents, every echo in the hallways, felt like it was tied to that sound. I tried to act normal, but inside, I was spiraling. What if it was someone trapped? What if the rumors about experiments on humans weren't just conspiracy fodder? I decided I needed answers. I started paying closer attention to section D-8 during my rounds, deliberately slowing my pace near the restricted rooms. The windows on the doors were small, just big enough to catch a glimpse of what might be inside. Most of the rooms were dark, but every so often I'd spot movement, flickers of shadows, shapes that didn't belong. On my third pass that day, I stopped at one of the lit rooms. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to lean closer, just enough to peek inside. There was someone sitting in the corner, their knees pulled up to their chest. Their face was obscured by their arms, but their body was thin, almost skeletal, like they hadn't eaten in weeks. I tapped lightly on the glass. "Hey," I whispered. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't move at first. Then slowly they raised their head, and I felt the breath leave my lungs. Their eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or rage. But it wasn't just the expression that unsettled me. It was the color. Their irises were unnaturally pale, almost translucent. like they'd been bleached. They stared at me for a long moment, unblinking before their lips moved. "Get out," they mouthed. No sound, just the silent formation of those words. Get. Outside, I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move. They just kept staring, their pale eyes locked onto mine, even as I turned and hurried down the hall. That night, the knocking came back. It started the same as before, soft, hesitant taps against the metal door. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the handle, willing it to stay still. But as the knocking grew louder, more insistent, I knew I couldn't ignore it this time. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, ready to confront whoever, or whatever, was out there. The hallway was empty, again. I stepped out, shining the beam of light down the corridor. The facility was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you feel like you're underwater. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something on the floor just a few feet away. It was a slip of paper, folded into a neat square. I picked it up with trembling hands, unfolding it slowly. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, and the message sent a chill straight down my spine. "They're lying to you. It's not just experiments. Look in Lab 4. B-Lab 4B wasn't on my usual rounds, but I knew where it was. It was one of the rooms deeper in the restricted zone, past where I was technically allowed to go. But after everything I'd seen and heard, I couldn't just ignore the note. The facility felt different that night as I made my way toward Lab 4B. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to follow me as I walked. My footsteps echoed louder than usual, and every so often I thought I heard something behind me. A soft shuffle, like bare feet on the polished floor. When I reached the door to Lab 4B, my hands were slick with sweat. The small window was dark, but the faint glow of a monitor inside cast enough light to make out vague shapes. The door was locked. Of course it was. But as I reached for my badge, I noticed something strange. The keypad next to the door was flashing red, indicating an override. Someone had already unlocked it. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The room was freezing, far colder than the rest of the facility. The air smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic, like copper. Rows of monitors lined the walls, each displaying live feeds from different parts of the lab. But the thing that caught my attention immediately was the chair in the center of the room. It wasn't just a chair. It was a restraint, metal, bolted to the floor, with straps hanging loosely from the armrests and footrests. There was dried blood on the seat, faint but unmistakable. I took a step closer, my breath fogging in the cold air. That's when I noticed the file sitting on the desk nearby. It was open, pages scattered, as if someone had been reading it in a hurry. I leaned over, scanning the first few lines. Subject number 42, volunteer. Initial testing on neural adaptation successful. Subject displaying resistance to memory reconstruction, increasing dosage. The file included photos, too. Grainy black and white images of a man strapped to the same chair, his face contorted in pain. The captions were clinical, describing procedures I didn't understand but could tell were invasive. And then there was the last page. It wasn't a report, it was a note, handwritten in the same shaky script as the one I'd found outside my door. "They can see you. If you're reading this, it's too late." The monitors behind me flickered, and I turned to see the live feeds glitching, they static, crawling across the screens. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving in one of the restricted hallways. A dark shape, tall and hunched, lurching toward the camera. Then the screen went black. The sound of heavy breathing filled the room, low and guttural, like an animal. But it wasn't coming from the monitors. It was coming from behind me. I didn't look. I didn't want to see what was there. I bolted out of Lab 4B, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing so fast I thought I might pass out. The hallways were darker now, the lights flickering like something was draining the energy out of them. As I ran, I swore I could hear footsteps behind me. Not the steady rhythmic kind. These were erratic, dragging like someone, or something, was limping after me. When I finally reached my quarters, I locked the door and collapsed against it, struggling to catch my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside. For a moment there was silence. Then slowly, deliberately, the knocking started again. The knocking didn't stop that night. It wasn't loud or frantic. It was slow, deliberate, like whoever was on the other side wanted me to feel every tap reverberate in my chest. I sat on the floor, clutching the flashlight I hadn't turned on, because deep down I knew it wouldn't help. Tap, tap, tap. Each knock felt like it was asking a question I didn't want to answer. I told myself I wasn't going to open the door again, but as the minutes dragged into hours, my resolve crumbled. I needed to know who or what was out there. This time, when I opened the door, the hallway wasn't empty. At first I thought it was a trick of the dim light. A figure stood at the far end of the corridor, its back to me, tall and motionless. It wore what looked like a hospital gown, the fabric torn and hanging loosely off its emaciated frame. The way it stood wasn't natural. Its shoulders were hunched, its head tilted slightly to the side, like it was listening for something. I wanted to close the door and lock it, but my hand wouldn't move. Instead, I stepped out into the hallway, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't react. It just stood there, its bare feet planted firmly on the cold floor. "Hello?" My voice came out as a whisper, barely audible over the sound of my heartbeat. Slowly, the figure turned. Its face was the stuff of nightmares, not because it was grotesque, but because it wasn't complete. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over its skull. Where its eyes should have been were empty sockets, hollow and black. Its mouth hung open, but there were no teeth, no tongue, just a void that seemed to pull the light from the hallway. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it raised one skeletal hand and pointed down the hall, toward the restricted zone. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. My voice was trembling. "I'm not going back there." The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its hand outstretched, as if daring me to follow its command. The longer I stared at it, the harder it became to look away, like its hollow eyes were pulling me in, consuming every rational thought I had left. And then, without warning, it collapsed. It didn't fall like a person. It crumpled, its body folding in on itself like a puppet with its strings cut. In the blink of an eye, it was gone, leaving nothing but a faint impression in the dust on the floor where it had stood. I didn't sleep after that. How could I? I sat in my room, staring at the door, waiting for the knocking to start again. But the rest of the night passed in silence, save for the faint hum of the ventilation system. By the time my shift started the next day, I felt like a walking corpse. The routine tasks did little to distract me. I delivered reports, ran diagnostics, all while pretending I wasn't one wrong step away from breaking down. But the weight of what I'd seen the night before pressed on me, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, or the way it had pointed toward the restricted zone. By the time my rounds took me back to Section D8, I was a mess. My hands were slick with sweat, and every shadow seemed to shift in the corner of my vision. The doors with reinforced windows felt like they were watching me, the darkness behind them alive and waiting, and then I saw it. The door to Lab 4B was open. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. No one had mentioned the door being unlocked, and I couldn't think of a single reason why anyone would leave it that way. But something about it felt intentional, like it was a trap. I stepped closer, the sound of my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The air grew colder the closer I got, the faint metallic smell from the night before creeping into my nostrils. I stopped just outside the door, peering into the room. It was empty, or at least it seemed that way. The chair in the center was still there, the bloodstains on the seat darker than I remembered. The monitors lining the walls flickered faintly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the floor. Then I noticed the file on the desk. It wasn't the same file I'd seen before. This one was closed, its edges worn and yellowed, like it had been sitting there for years. Against my better judgment, I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the brittle paper. The moment I opened it, the lights in the room flickered, and a low hum filled the air. The file contained only a single photograph, a grainy black and white image of a person strapped to the chair. Their face was obscured, but their body was covered in scars, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Scrawled across the bottom of the photograph in jagged handwriting were 3 words: "Help them escape." The hum grew louder, and the monitors began to glitch, static filling the screens. For a brief moment, I thought I saw the face of the figure from the hallway, its empty eyes staring back at me through the static. Then the screens went dark, and the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The room was pitch black now, the hum so loud it felt like it was vibrating through my skull. And then from somewhere in the darkness, I heard it. The voice. "Help me." It wasn't a whisper this time. It was louder, more desperate, echoing off the walls like it was coming from everywhere at once. My flashlight flickered, the beam barely piercing the suffocating dark. And then I saw them. They were standing in the corners of the room, figures, just like the one from the hallway, their bodies thin and contorted, their eyeless faces turned toward me. There were at least 6 of them, their forms barely visible in the faint, flickering light. "Help us," one of them said, its voice ragged and broken. I backed away, my legs trembling, until I hit the desk. The file slipped from my hands, the photograph fluttering to the ground. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was being dragged by invisible strings. "You have to help us," it rasped. Before I could respond, the hum in the room exploded into a deafening roar, and the figures vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. I don't remember how I got out of Lab 4B. One moment I was frozen, and the next I was running down the hallway, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The lights in the facility flickered wildly, casting everything in a strobe-like glow. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting and stretching as if they were alive. When I finally reached my quarters, I slammed the door shut and locked it, collapsing onto the floor. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. The memory of those figures burned into my mind. I should have left then. I should have packed my things and walked out, no matter what it cost me. But something was keeping me there, something that wanted me to see this through. I couldn't shake the feeling that the note, "Help them escape," wasn't just a warning. It was a command, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was in over my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, or lack of faces, really. The empty eyes, the twisted limbs, and the way their voices echoed like they were speaking from the bottom of a well. By morning, I made a decision. I had to figure out what was going on. Not for some heroic reason, either. At that point, it was self-preservation. Whatever they were, I was convinced they weren't going to let me leave until I did something. I started by retracing my steps, going over every detail I'd seen in the restricted zone. The chair, the notes, the figures in the shadows, they all pointed to one thing: the subjects. The files I'd seen referred to them in the vaguest terms. But it was clear these weren't normal experiments. Whatever they were doing to these people wasn't for science. It was something darker. The facility's layout didn't make it easy to dig deeper. The restricted areas were sectioned off, and most of the doors required clearance I didn't have. But I'd overheard enough conversations between staff to know there was one place that might hold the answers. The holding wing. I'd never been there before, but I'd seen it on a map during orientation. It was buried deep within the restricted zone, past a set of double doors I'd always been told to avoid. Something about the way people talked about it. The clipped, nervous tone told me that's where the subjects were kept. Getting there wasn't easy. The hallways were eerily quiet, the usual hum of machinery muffled, like the facility itself was holding its breath. Every sound I made, my footsteps, the rustle of my clothes, felt deafening. By the time I reached the double doors, my palms were slick with sweat, and my heart was pounding like a drum. The keypad next to the door blinked red, locked as I expected, but someone had forgotten to close the maintenance panel beside it. I'm not proud to admit it, but I'd seen enough spy movies to know how to short-circuit a basic lock. With a few careful movements, I managed to bypass the system, and the doors slid open with a low hiss. The holding wing was different from the rest of the facility. The air was colder, heavier, and carried a faint metallic tang that reminded me of blood. The lights overhead were dim, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The hallway stretched out in front of me, lined with thick steel doors on either side. Each door had a small, reinforced window, and as I passed the first one, I couldn't help but glance inside. The figure in the room wasn't human anymore, at least not entirely. Their body was hunched and skeletal, their skin a sickly gray that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. They were strapped to a chair, their heads slumped forward, but when I moved closer, their head snapped up. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. Their eyes, if you could call them that, were a milky white, their pupils barely visible. Their mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, they started thrashing against the restraints, their movements jerky and unnatural. I turned away, my stomach churning, and moved to the next door. The second subject was even worse. They weren't strapped down like the first one. Instead, they stood perfectly still in the center of the room, their head tilted at an odd angle. Their arms hung limply at their sides, but their fingers twitched, curling and uncurling like they were waiting to grab something. When I shined my flashlight through the window, they turned toward me. "Help me," they whispered, their voice distorted and broken, like a radio signal struggling to come through. But their lips didn't move. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't see. I staggered back from the door, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The words from the note echoed in my mind. Help them escape. I forced myself to keep going. Each room I passed told the same story. People who had once been human, now reduced to twisted, broken versions of themselves. Some sat silently, their faces blank and lifeless. Others moved in erratic, unsettling ways, their bodies bending at impossible angles. And through it all, the whispers followed me. Help us. Get out. They're watching. At the end of the hall, I found a room that was different from the others. The door was larger, thicker, with multiple locks securing it in place. A small plaque beside it read, "Observation." The keypad was glowing green, unlocked. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I'd come this far, and some part of me knew that whatever was in that room was the key to all of this. I pushed the door open. The observation room was massive, far bigger than any of the other holding cells. The walls were lined with monitors, each displaying live feeds from different parts of the facility. But in the center of the room was a glass enclosure, and inside was something I'll never forget. It was a person, or at least, it used to be. Their body was suspended in a tank of some kind of fluid, wires and tubes snaking out from their arms, legs, and torso. Their eyes were open, staring blankly ahead, but their chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. As I approached the glass, I noticed something written on the inside of the tank. It was faint, scrawled in what looked like blood, but I could just make out the words, "Stop them." The monitors behind me flickered, and I turned to see the live feeds glitching, static crawling across the screens. For a brief moment, one of the cameras showed the hallway I'd come through. The doors to the holding cells were open. The subjects were gone. The static on the monitors grew louder, drowning out every other sound. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, as the shadows in the observation room began to move. They weren't cast by the light. They were alive, shifting and crawling across the walls like ink spreading through water. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. "Help us! Run! They're here!" The shadows converged, forming a shape that towered over me, its eyeless face stretching into a grotesque grin. I bolted for the door, the whispers chasing me down the hallway like a wave. As I ran, I caught glimpses of the subjects, moving through the shadows, their distorted bodies jerking unnaturally. They didn't chase me. They didn't need to. The facility itself seemed to shift around me, the hallways stretching endlessly, the lights flickering and dying one by one. By the time I reached the exit, I wasn't sure if I was running towards safety or straight into the trap they'd set for me. When I burst outside, the cold desert air hit me like a slap. The facility loomed behind me, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Whatever was inside wasn't human anymore, and it wasn't staying there for long. The moment I reached my car, I slammed the door shut and locked it, like a flimsy piece of metal would keep me safe from whatever I'd just seen. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the keys into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I hit the gas and sped down the dirt road, leading away from the facility, the dust rising in thick clouds behind me. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the endless stretch of desert ahead. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. It wasn't just paranoia. I could feel it, a heavy weight pressing against the back of my neck, like unseen eyes burning holes into my skin. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. The road behind me wasn't empty. At first it looked like shadows, dark, shifting shapes stretching across the road, too large to belong to anything natural. But as I sped up, the shapes grew clearer. Figures, twisted skeletal forms running faster than any human could, their movements jerky and disjointed, like they were being dragged forward by invisible strings. One of them turned its head toward me, and even at that distance I could see its face, or the lack of one. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers, and its mouth was stretched open in a grotesque, silent scream. I floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as the speedometer climbed. But no matter how fast I drove, the figures didn't fall behind. They stayed just at the edge of the headlights, their long limbs bending and snapping as they moved, like their bodies didn't understand how to exist in this world. and then the car sputtered. The engine stuttered once, twice, and then died completely, leaving me coasting in silence. I yanked the wheel to the side, pulling the car off the road just as it rolled to a stop. The headlights flickered once before going out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my own heartbeat, drowning out the stillness of the night. Then I heard it, the tapping. It started softly, like fingers drumming against glass, and for a brief moment, I thought it was coming from inside the car. My breath hitched as I scanned the windows, the flashlight in my lap trembling in my hands. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, and this time it was coming from outside, from the roof. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My entire body was frozen, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. The flashlight slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. The tapping stopped. I discovered a dark web video discussing mind control projects. It describes everything that's been happening to me lately. I'll be honest, I wasn't looking for trouble. It's not like I woke up one day and thought, hey, let's go diving into the deepest, creepiest parts of the internet. But that's how these things start, isn't it? You're bored, maybe a little curious, and before you know it, you've seen things you can't unsee. It started 2 weeks ago. I was scrolling through some tech forum, looking for info on a weird glitch my laptop had been having, when someone posted about the real internet. Not Google, not Reddit, something deeper. They called it the dark web. Most of the comments were jokes or warnings. Don't go there unless you're ready to get your life ruined, one guy wrote. Another said, most of it is scams, but if you dig deep enough, you'll find stuff you wish you hadn't. Now, I'm not a tech genius or anything, but I know enough to be dangerous. I figured I'd take a peek, see what all the fuss was about. Just curiosity. Harmless, right? Setting it up was easier than I expected. A couple of guides, a download or two, and suddenly I was in this whole other world. The normal rules of the internet didn't seem to apply here. No flashy ads, no sleek designs, just bare-bones pages, cryptic usernames, and a constant, uneasy feeling that someone was watching. At first it was just weird stuff. Forums about conspiracy theories, marketplaces selling things I don't even want to think about, chat rooms where people talked like they were in some kind of secret club. Most of it felt fake, like the internet equivalent of those haunted houses that try too hard to scare you. But then I found the video. It was buried on a page that didn't even have a proper name, just a string of random characters. The title caught my eye immediately. Project Mnemosyne, a case study in cognitive manipulation. I clicked it, and the page went black for a second before a grainy video player popped up. The first few seconds were nothing but static, and I almost backed out, thinking it was broken. But then the static cleared, and a face filled the screen. It wasn't like any face I'd ever seen. It was covered in shadows, the features distorted by the low-quality video, but the eyes were sharp, too sharp, like they didn't belong to the rest of the face. "Welcome," the voice said, low and mechanical, like it had been run through some kind of filter. "If you're watching this, it's too late for you." I almost laughed. It sounded like the opening line to a bad horror movie. But there was something about the way they said it. Flat, emotionless, like it wasn't a warning but a statement of fact. The video went on to describe something called Project Mnemosyne, supposedly a government-funded experiment to study and control human thought. The idea was to implant memories, erase others, and subtly alter behavior without the subject realizing it. At first it sounded ridiculous, like some wild conspiracy theory meant to scare people. But then the video got specific. It described the symptoms of someone under the influence of the project. Unexplained déjà vu, often tied to places or events you've never experienced. Sleep disturbances, particularly vivid repetitive dreams. Sudden irrational thoughts or impulses that feel foreign, like they're not your own. Physical signs, headaches, sensitivity to light, nosebleeds. And the kicker? The video claimed that anyone who had found the page had been targeted, that their data had been flagged, and that the project was already working on them. I was about to close the page when the video did something that stopped me cold. It said my name. At first I thought I'd misheard. The distorted voice was hard to make out, and the audio was crackling like an old vinyl record. But then it said it again, slower this time, and there was no mistaking it. My name. You are part of the experiment. I slammed my laptop shut so hard the table shook. My heart was racing, my hands slick with sweat. How the hell did it know my name? I told myself it was a coincidence, a trick, maybe some kind of prank. But that didn't explain the feeling crawling up my spine, like something had shifted in the room. I stared at the closed laptop, half expecting it to open on its own. Nothing happened, just silence. The rest of the night was a blur. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just paranoia. I mean, it wasn't like a video could actually do anything to me, right? But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes on the screen. And then the dreams started. At first, they didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary, just strange, disjointed images. Faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been. But they felt real, too real. The worst one happened 3 days after I watched the video. I was standing in a dark room, staring at a wall covered in photographs. Most of them were blurry, but one was crystal clear. A picture of me, sitting at my desk, staring at my laptop. I turned around, and there was a figure standing in the shadows. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were looking at me. "You shouldn't have watched it," they said, their voice low and distorted, just like the video. When I woke up, my nose was bleeding. At first, I tried to convince myself it was stress. I mean, who wouldn't feel a little freaked out after something like that? But the signs kept piling up. I started noticing weird things. Déjà vu, like I'd been places I knew I hadn't. Random headaches that came out of nowhere and left me feeling drained. And once, while I was brushing my teeth, I looked in the mirror and swore for half a second my reflection didn't move. The worst part, it wasn't just me. I caught my roommate staring at me the other night, his expression blank, like he didn't recognize me. When I asked if he was okay, he just blinked and walked away without saying a word. I don't know what's happening, but I'm starting to think that video wasn't just some elaborate hoax. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I'd let the video get to me. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. The worst part? It wasn't just a feeling. The first sign came a couple of days later. I was sitting at my desk, trying to distract myself with work, when I noticed it. My laptop camera. The little green light that's supposed to turn on when it's active. It flickered for a split second. At first I thought it was a glitch. Maybe the software was acting up, or maybe I'd accidentally opened something in the background. But when I checked, nothing was running. And then it happened again. This time, the light stayed on for a full 2 seconds before turning off, long enough to send a cold chill down my spine. I covered the camera with a sticky note, my hands shaking. It felt stupid, like putting tape over a peephole when you already know someone's on the other side. But it made me feel a little better, at least until the sound started. It was subtle at first, just faint static crackling through my headphones. I figured it was interference or maybe a loose wire, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just static anymore. It was breathing, slow and steady, like someone was standing right behind me, just out of sight. I yanked the headphones off and spun around, half expecting to see someone there. The room was empty. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the faint hum of my laptop. I stared at the screen, at the covered camera, and my stomach twisted. What if it wasn't the camera they were using? What if it was the mic? I muted everything, unplugged the headphones, and shut the laptop, slamming it shut like it could somehow stop whatever was happening. But the feeling didn't go away. That night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. At first, I thought it was just a notification, but when I picked it up, there was no alert, no missed call, just the home screen. The buzzing started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from the dresser. I froze, my hand tightening around the phone. The sound wasn't loud, but it was rhythmic, almost mechanical, like the faint hum of machinery. It didn't make sense. There was nothing in the dresser that could make a sound like that. Cautiously, I got up and opened the top drawer. Nothing but some old receipts and random junk. The buzzing stopped. I stood there, staring at the empty drawer, my heart pounding. I was about to close it when I noticed something weird. The receipts. They were moving. Not a lot, just barely enough to see. It was like they were being pushed from underneath. I reached down, my fingers brushing against the wood, and felt it. A thin, almost invisible wire running along the bottom of the drawer. What the hell was that? The next morning, I tore the dresser apart. I took out every drawer, flipped them over, and checked every inch of the wood. I found nothing, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I started noticing other things, small, subtle changes around the apartment. My phone would vibrate even when there were no notifications. Doors that I was sure I'd closed would be slightly ajar. And then there were the lights. At night, when I was trying to sleep, the light from the street lamp outside my window would flicker. It wasn't random, though. It was rhythmic, like Morse code. At first, I tried to ignore it, but after the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled out my phone and recorded the flickering, hoping I could convince myself it was just a coincidence. When I played the video back, the flickering wasn't there, but there was something else. A shadow. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, in the corner of the video, just barely visible against the wall. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't still either, like it was pulsing, shifting between shapes that didn't make sense. I rewound the video and paused it, squinting at the screen. The more I stared at it, the more my chest tightened, like the air was being sucked out of the room. And then for just a split second, it moved. Not in the video, in the corner of the room. I dropped the phone and turned on every light in the apartment, my hands shaking. The shadow was gone, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I went to a coffee shop and spent hours researching everything I could about Project Mnemosyne. Most of it was the same conspiracy theory junk I'd seen on the dark web, but one thing stood out. A forum post from 3 years ago, written by someone claiming to be a whistleblower. The post described a program designed to observe and condition individuals without their knowledge. It talked about hidden cameras, subliminal messages, and a constant, invisible presence meant to slowly unravel your sanity. The last line sent a chill down my spine. If you're seeing this, they already know, and they won't stop until you're one of them. I tried to find more from the user, but their account was gone, scrubbed clean, like it had never existed. When I got home that evening, the apartment was different. It wasn't anything obvious. Everything was where I'd left it, doors locked, windows shut. But it felt wrong, like I was walking into someone else's space. Then I saw the laptop. It was open. I hadn't touched it since the night before. The sticky note I'd put over the camera was gone, replaced with a single word written on the screen in large, bold letters. Stop. My heart sank. I didn't know what they wanted, but one thing was clear. They were in my life now, and they weren't going anywhere. I didn't touch the laptop. I couldn't. Seeing the word "stop" in bold letters felt like someone had reached through the screen and spoken directly to me. The air in my apartment felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. I grabbed my keys and left without looking back. For the next few hours, I wandered aimlessly through the city, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was all a prank, a messed-up, elaborate joke by someone who'd hacked my laptop. But who would do that? And why? Every time I thought about the word on the screen, my chest tightened. It wasn't just a warning, it was a command. By the time I got back to the apartment, it was late. I stood outside the door for a long time, staring at the lock, debating whether I should even go inside. My fingers hesitated on the key, and that's when I noticed it. The faint glow of light coming from under the door. I was sure I'd turned off every light before I left. My heart was pounding as I stepped inside, knife from my car's emergency kit in hand. The light was coming from the living room, soft and flickering, like a candle or a screen. The laptop. It was on again, sitting on the coffee table where I'd left it. The screen glowed, the cursor blinking in the middle of a blank document. Then right in front of me, words started to appear. "You've been warned." I stepped back, my hands trembling. The words kept coming, letter by letter, as if someone was typing them in real time. "You can't stop us." My breath hitched. "Who are you?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. The typing stopped for a moment, and then new words appeared. "We're already here." I slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing in the silent apartment. My pulse was racing, my skin clammy. I didn't know what to do, who to call. The police? What would I even tell them? That my laptop was haunted? I grabbed my phone and opened my contacts, my thumb hovering over my roommate's number. I hadn't seen him much lately. He'd been acting distant, almost robotic. But maybe he'd noticed something too. Before I could dial, the screen went black. At first I thought the battery had died, but when I tried to turn it back on, the screen stayed dark. Then from somewhere deep in the apartment, I heard it. The humming. It was the same sound I'd heard before. Faint and mechanical, like the low buzz of a machine warming up. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the dresser. It was coming from the bedroom. The knife felt heavier in my hand as I crept toward the door. The humming grew louder with every step, vibrating through the floorboards, through my chest, until it felt like my entire body was buzzing. I pushed the door open, and the sound stopped. The room was dark, but I could feel something was wrong. The air was colder, heavier, carrying that metallic stench I was starting to associate with them. I flicked on the light, and that's when I saw it. The mirror. At first it looked normal, just my reflection staring back at me, pale and wide-eyed. But as I stepped closer, I noticed the faintest distortion, like the glass was rippling. I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface. It felt warm, and then my reflection blinked. I froze. My hand was still on the glass, but the face staring back at me didn't match my movements anymore. It tilted its head, its expression slowly shifting into a blank, eerie smile. "You're wasting time," it said, its voice flat and distorted, like a recording played backward. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair as I scrambled out of the room. The last thing I saw before I slammed the door was my reflection, standing perfectly still, watching me with that impossible smile. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with every light in the apartment on, clutching the knife like it was the only thing keeping me safe. Around 3 a.m., the buzzing started again. This time, it was everywhere, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a vibration, rattling the windows and making my teeth ache. And then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. I was plunged into darkness, the kind that feels alive, wrapping around you and filling every corner of your mind with dread. And then the voice came. You can't run. It wasn't coming from the laptop or the phone this time. It was everywhere, surrounding me, inside me. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. You invited us in. You gave us access. No, I screamed, my voice cracking. I didn't. You watched the video. You opened the door. The air grew colder, and I could feel something moving around me, just out of reach. I swung the knife wildly, but it didn't hit anything, and then I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. I spun around, slashing blindly, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, silent except for my ragged breathing. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table, and that's when I saw the laptop. It was open again, the screen glowing faintly in the darkness. One final message was waiting for me. It's too late. You belong to us now. And just like that, the screen went black. The lights came back on a few minutes later. Everything looked normal. No shadows, no buzzing, no voices. But I knew better. They weren't gone. They were just waiting. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment. Whatever was happening wasn't going to stop. And every second I spent there felt like one step closer to losing my mind. I threw some clothes into a bag and left without looking back. I didn't have a plan, just the need to get as far away as possible. I ended up driving aimlessly for hours, eventually pulling into a cheap motel on the edge of town. The place smelled like mildew, and the fluorescent lights in the parking lot buzzed incessantly, but it felt safer than home. Or so I thought. I left my laptop in the car. I didn't trust it anymore, not after everything that had happened. My phone was dead, so I plugged it into the wall charger and sat on the bed, staring at the blank TV screen. For the first time in days, the quiet felt almost normal. I let myself relax just a little, thinking maybe I'd finally outrun whatever was happening. Then the TV turned on. It clicked to life without warning, the screen filled with static. I grabbed the remote, pressing every button, but nothing worked. The static shifted, and I realized it wasn't random. It was forming shapes, letters. You can't hide. I scrambled off the bed, my heart pounding. Leave me alone, I yelled at the screen, feeling ridiculous for talking to a TV. The static flickered, and the message changed. We're inside. Inside what? The room? My head? I didn't stick around to find out. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the car, fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock the door. When I finally got in, I locked the doors and started the engine, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was someone sitting in the back seat. I screamed, slamming on the brakes and whipping around to face the back. The seat was empty. The car sat idling in the middle of the road as I tried to catch my breath. My reflection in the mirror stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but nothing else was there. I floored it, the tires screeching as I sped away from the motel. My mind was racing. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was real, and it was following me. I ended up at a 24-hour diner, sitting in a booth near the window where I could see the car. I didn't trust it, didn't trust anything anymore. The waitress brought me coffee, and I sipped it slowly, my hands trembling around the mug. As I sat there, staring into the dark liquid, I realized something. This all started with the video. Whatever this was, whatever they were, it began the moment I clicked on that link. If I could figure out where it came from, maybe I could stop it. I pulled out my phone, which had finally charged, and started digging. It wasn't easy. The site where I'd found the video was gone, like it had been wiped from existence. But I remembered the name, Project Mnemosyne. I searched every forum, every conspiracy theory blog, every dark corner of the web I could find. Most of what I found was nonsense, wild stories about mind control and government experiments. But one thread caught my attention. It was buried on an old message board, the kind no one used anymore. A user had posted a long, rambling explanation about Mnemosyne, claiming it wasn't just a project, but a network, a system designed to infiltrate and manipulate minds. They described it as a digital virus, something that didn't just infect your computer, but you. The moment you see it, it's too late. The post read, "It rewires your perception, breaks you down until you're nothing but a signal for them to use." I scrolled down to the comments, most of which were mocking or dismissive, but one reply stood out. "They watch through reflections, avoid mirrors, avoid screens. They'll find you anyway, but it slows them down." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The mirror in my bedroom, the laptop screen, even the TV. They weren't just watching me. They were coming through. I glanced at the diner window, at my reflection staring back at me from the glass. For a moment I thought I saw it ripple, just like the mirror had back home. I shoved my phone into my pocket and left without finishing my coffee. Back in the car, I avoided looking at the rearview mirror as I drove. I didn't know where I was going, just that I couldn't stop. The words from the forum echoed in my head. "They'll find you anyway." The radio crackled, static filling the car. I hadn't even turned it on. The static shifted, forming a familiar pattern. "Stop running." I yanked the knob, trying to turn it off, but the static only grew louder. "It's your fault." "Shut up," I screamed, slamming my fist against the dashboard. The static cut off, and the car went silent. For a moment I thought it was over. Then the headlights flickered, and I realized the engine had died. I was stranded on an empty road, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I grabbed the knife from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, the night air cold against my skin. The road was quiet, too quiet, like the world had stopped around me. No wind, no crickets, nothing. And then I saw them. Shapes in the distance, just barely visible in the glow of the dying headlights. They weren't human. Too tall, too thin, their limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. I backed toward the car, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. My eyes darted between the shapes, waiting for them to do something, anything. Then one of them stepped forward. I scrambled back into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. The figures didn't run. They didn't have to. They were slow, deliberate, like they knew I had nowhere to go. The static started again, this time from my phone. I pulled it out, my hands shaking, and saw a single message on the screen. "You can't escape." The figures were closer now, their faces, or what should have been faces, blank and smooth, like reflections in rippling water. I closed my eyes, gripping the knife like it was the only thing tethering me to reality, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. I kept my eyes shut tight, clutching the knife as if it could do anything against the figures outside. The air inside the car felt heavy, almost suffocating, like it was pressing against my chest. The static from my phone buzzed louder, filling the small space with its relentless hum. I couldn't stay like this forever. They were closing in. I could feel it, even without looking, an oppressive weight, a presence that pushed against the edges of my mind. I opened my eyes. The figures were just outside the car now, their distorted shapes barely visible in the faint glow of the headlights. They didn't move like people. Their limbs seemed to stretch and ripple, their heads tilting at impossible angles, and their faces. They didn't have eyes or mouths, just smooth, featureless voids that seemed to pull the light into them. One of them reached out, its elongated hand brushing against the glass. The window didn't crack or shatter, but the glass rippled, like water disturbed by a single drop. The static on my phone shifted, turning into whispers, low and guttural, overlapping in a way that made my stomach churn. I didn't need to understand the words to know what they meant. I was theirs. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "No, you're not taking me." I fumbled with the knife, gripping it so tightly that my hand cramped. My thoughts were racing, desperate for some kind of plan, some way out of this. And then I remembered the thread on the forum. They watch through reflections. Avoid mirrors. Avoid screens. I looked at my phone, still buzzing with static, and made a decision. Without thinking, I threw the phone out of the car. It hit the pavement with a dull thud, the static cutting off instantly. For a moment, the figures outside hesitated, their heads tilted in unison, as if confused, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted ever so slightly. It worked, but only for a second. The headlights flickered, and the figures turned back to me. Their movements were faster now, jerky and unnatural, like they were glitching through reality itself. The glass rippled again, and this time I could see their fingers pressing through it, stretching into the car like liquid shadows. I screamed, swinging the knife wildly, but it passed through them like air. The shadows recoiled, but only briefly. They were toying with me, wearing me down. I needed to get out. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and bolted. The night air was freezing, and the darkness felt alive, pressing against me from all sides. I didn't know where I was running, just away. The road stretched endlessly, the figures always just behind me. No matter how fast I ran, they were there, their distorted shapes flickering in and out of existence like a stuttering video. And the whispers, they were back. "You can't run. You're part of us now. Stop resisting." The words weren't just in my ears. They were in my head, burrowing deep, pulling at my thoughts. I tripped, hitting the pavement hard. The knife clattered out of my hand, and pain shot through my arm, but I didn't stop. I crawled forward, desperate to put distance between me and them. That's when I saw it. A faint glow in the distance, flickering like a dying flame. I scrambled toward the light, my lungs burning with every breath. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a flame at all. It was a screen. A large, old-fashioned CRT monitor sat in the middle of the road, its static-filled display flickering erratically. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But the figures were closing in, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. I didn't have a choice. I reached the monitor and stared at the screen. The static shifted, forming shapes and patterns that twisted my stomach into knots. It wasn't random. It was my face. The image on the screen blinked, God's eyes moving independently of mine. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, the corners curling unnaturally high. "You understand now," it said, its voice echoing with a dozen overlapping tones. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No, but this isn't real. You're not real." The figure on the screen laughed, a sound that rattled deep in my chest. "You let us in. The signal is everywhere. You belong to us." The monitor flickered, And suddenly, I was surrounded. The figures closed in, their bodies stretching and twisting into impossible shapes. The whispers became a deafening roar, drowning out my thoughts, filling my head with static. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears, but it didn't help. The static wasn't just around me. It was inside me, clawing at my mind, pulling me apart. And then all at once, it stopped. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment. The room was exactly as I'd left it, messy, dimly lit, with my laptop sitting on the coffee table. The word stop was still on the screen, the cursor blinking patiently. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream, but then I noticed my reflection in the darkened TV screen. It was smiling, and I wasn't. I don't leave the apartment anymore. I don't touch mirrors, screens, or anything that might show my reflection. But it doesn't matter. They're still here. They're always here. And now, I'm part of them. I joined a dark web forum that maps haunted places. My apartment building is marked as unlivable. You ever go down one of those weird internet rabbit holes? You know, the kind where you start with something innocent, like looking up conspiracy theories for fun, and somehow end up way deeper than you ever planned. That's exactly how I found the forum. It started on one of those late nights when I couldn't sleep. I'd been binging videos about the supernatural, ghost hunters, urban legends, all that kind of stuff. Around 2 a.m., I stumbled across a Reddit post about haunted locations in my city. Most of the comments were pretty standard. Old theaters, abandoned hospitals, even a cemetery or two. But then someone dropped a link. It was buried in the replies, like they didn't want too many people to see it. The comment simply said, "If you're looking for real haunted places, this is where you'll find them. But don't say I didn't warn you." Curiosity got the better of me. The link didn't lead to a normal website. It was a .onion address. For those of you who don't know, that means it was on the dark web. I'd messed around with Tor before, mostly out of boredom, so it didn't take me long to get in. The site was called Haunt Tracker. It looked basic, almost like a 90s web page, with grainy photos and plain text. The homepage was simple. A welcome message that read, "Mapping the haunted and the forsaken since 2012, followed by a disclaimer about entering at your own risk. There was a world map in the center of the page, dotted with red markers. When you clicked on one, it would zoom in and give you details about the location, what kind of hauntings had been reported, how dangerous it was, and whether or not it was safe to visit. I spent hours clicking around, reading about creepy mansions, cursed forests, and abandoned theme parks. But then, just for fun, I zoomed in on my city. There weren't many markers in my area, but one caught my eye immediately. It wasn't some old landmark or run-down building. It was my apartment complex. The marker was bright red, and when I clicked on it, a single word popped up: unlivable. I stared at the screen for a solid minute, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. I mean, I'd lived in this building for 2 years. Sure, it wasn't perfect. The elevator broke down a lot, and the landlord was a ghost when it came to fixing anything. But unlivable? I scrolled down to the description. It was short, but unsettling. Residents report unexplained noises, shadow figures, and missing time. Multiple disappearances linked to this location. High risk. Do not enter. What the hell did that mean? Disappearances? Missing time? I'd never noticed anything weird. But now that I thought about it, there were little things, like how my neighbor across the hall had moved out suddenly without saying goodbye, or the fact that the guy who lived above me had been gone for weeks, but his mail kept piling up in front of his door. I brushed it off as paranoia. The dark web is full of fake stories and hoaxes, and this was probably just someone trying to freak people out. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept into my chest. The next morning I tried to forget about it. I went to work, came home, and kept telling myself it was just some dumb website. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, something strange happened. I was brushing my teeth when I heard a faint knock. It was so soft, I almost missed it. But it was definitely coming from my front door. I rinsed my mouth and walked over, figuring it was the landlord or maybe a neighbor. But when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. "Hello?" I called out, opening the door just a crack. The hallway was empty. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. Then I noticed something on the floor. It was a folded piece of paper, placed neatly right in front of my door. I bent down to pick it up, and as I unfolded it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The paper was blank, except for 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Get out now." I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards, felt louder, more sinister. I kept telling myself it was a prank, but the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. By the time morning rolled around, I was ready to confront my landlord. I needed answers. His office was in the basement, a cramped little room that always smelled like mildew. When I knocked, he opened the door just a crack, peering out at me with bloodshot eyes. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice raspy. I held up the note. "Do you know anything about this?" He glanced at the paper and froze. His expression went blank, like he'd been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. "Where did you find that?" "Outside my door. Is this someone's idea of a joke?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the door a little wider and gestured for me to come inside. The office was a mess, piles of paperwork everywhere, a half-eaten sandwich on the desk, and an ancient TV playing static in the corner. He shut the door behind me and locked it, which immediately put me on edge. "Look," he said, sitting down heavily in his chair. "You didn't hear this from me, all right?" "Hear what?" He sighed and rubbed his temples. "This building, it's old, real old. There's some history here." "What kind of history?" He hesitated, like he was trying to decide how much to tell me. Finally, he said, "You ever heard of the Haywood disappearances?" I shook my head. "Figures," he muttered. "Happened back in the 70s. 10 people vanished from this building over the course of a year. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no nothing. Just gone." My stomach churned. They shut the place down for a while, but eventually someone bought it and reopened it. Cheap rent and all that. But weird stuff kept happening. People moving out without warning, hearing things, seeing things. I thought about the note. "So what? You're saying the place is haunted?" He shrugged. "I'm saying you should probably listen to that note." I left his office feeling worse than when I went in. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from inside my closet. The tapping started slow. At first I thought it might be the building settling, or maybe a draft knocking something around. But it wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it, steady, deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the pounding in my chest. The sound was faint but unmistakable, and it was definitely coming from the closet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse. It was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the streetlights outside and the distant rumble of a car engine. I stared at the closet door, half expecting it to swing open on its own, but it just sat there. innocuous and unassuming. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I swung my legs out of bed. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath, forcing myself to stand. Step by step I crossed the room, the light from my phone dancing on the door. When I reached it, I hesitated. There was no logical reason for me to be scared. It was just a closet, after all. But every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to open it. I grabbed the handle and turned it slowly. The hinges creaked as the door swung open, revealing nothing but my clothes and a few boxes stacked haphazardly on the floor. Relief flooded through me, but it didn't last long. As I moved the flashlight around, I noticed something strange. One of the boxes, a plain cardboard one I hadn't touched in months, was sitting slightly ajar. I knelt down, my heart still racing, and carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a mess of old papers, random knickknacks, and buried at the bottom, a Polaroid photo. I pulled it out, holding it up to the light. The picture was of me, but it wasn't a selfie, and it wasn't one I remembered anyone taking. I was sitting on my bed, staring at my laptop, completely unaware of the camera. My blood ran cold. I turned the photo over, hoping for some kind of explanation, and saw a date scrawled on the back in smudged ink. Last night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of my room with my back to the wall, clutching my phone like it was a weapon. Every creak and groan the building made felt like a threat. By morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment. I grabbed the photo, threw on some clothes, and headed straight for the landlord's office. This time, I didn't knock. I pushed the door open and stormed in, slamming the photo down on his desk. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. He looked up from his coffee, startled, and reached for the picture. His face went pale the second he saw it. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was in my closet, in a box I haven't touched in years." He stared at the photo for a long moment before setting it down and rubbing his temples. "You need to leave," he said finally. "What are you talking about? You can't just tell me to leave without an explanation." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I told you this place has history. Weird things happen here. I don't know why, and I don't want to know. But whatever's going on, it's not something you can fight." "Then why are you still here?" "I don't have a choice," he said, his voice bitter. "I manage the building. I live in the building. It's not like I can just pack up and leave." I shook my head, frustrated. "You've got to give me more than that. Who took this photo? How did it end up in my closet?" He didn't answer. Instead, he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder. He flipped through it before sliding a piece of paper across the desk. It was an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances Continue at Haywood Apartments." The article detailed the same story he'd told me before. 10 people, gone without a trace. But at the bottom was something new, a photo of a woman standing in front of the building. My stomach turned as I recognized her. It was my neighbor from across the hall, the one who'd moved out without saying goodbye. Only, the article was dated 1976. I left his office in a daze, clutching the newspaper clipping like it might offer me some kind of protection. As soon as I got back to my apartment, I started packing. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop. I didn't care what I left behind. I just wanted to get out. But as I was zipping up my bag, I heard it again. The tapping. It was louder this time, more insistent, and it wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from the front door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I unlocked the door and opened it just enough to peek outside. Sitting on the floor was another note, folded neatly in half. I picked it up with shaking hands and unfolded it. This time the message was longer, written in the same shaky handwriting. They won't let you leave. Stop trying. Accept it. I slammed the door and locked it, my mind racing. Who was they? The people who'd disappeared, the ones who left these notes? I didn't have time to figure it out. As I backed away from the door, I heard something else. A voice, whispering, coming from inside my apartment. The whispering was faint at first, like a draft catching words from somewhere far away. But as I stood there, frozen in place, it grew louder. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping, each one saying something different, too low for me to make out the words. It was coming from the bedroom. I wanted to run. Every instinct in me was screaming to grab my bag and get out. But the note, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. They won't let you leave. I had to know what they meant. Who were they? What did they want? And why was I hearing whispers inside my own home? I moved slowly toward the bedroom, my legs shaky, my breath shallow. The door was still open from the night before, and the room looked exactly the same. Bed unmade, blinds drawn, closet half open. But the sound was definitely coming from in there. I stepped inside, my phone light cutting through the dimness. The air felt colder, heavier, like the room itself was trying to push me out. "Hello?" I whispered, immediately regretting it. The voices stopped. Dead silence. I stayed perfectly still, my flashlight trembling as I swept it across the room. There was nothing. No one. Just my clothes, the pile of boxes, and the same cramped space I'd been sleeping in for 2 years. Then I noticed something new. The closet door. It was slightly more open than before. I walked toward it, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. The air grew colder with every step, and my flashlight dimmed, flickering like the battery was dying. Please, let this be a bad dream, I muttered to myself. Gripping the edge of the door, I pulled it open. At first I didn't see anything, just the same cluttered mess as always. But then I noticed the back wall. It wasn't solid anymore. The wall, which should have been plain drywall, was now a narrow, black void. It looked like a tunnel, but there was no light inside, just endless darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The whispering started again, louder this time, like the voices were coming from deep within the tunnel. "Stop," I said, my voice breaking. "Who's there?" The voices didn't answer. Instead, they grew more frantic, overlapping into a cacophony of incomprehensible words. It was like they were warning me, begging me, and threatening me all at once. And then I saw it. A hand. It wasn't fully formed, almost like a shadow pretending to be a hand, stretching out from the void. Long skeletal fingers curled around the edge of the tunnel, pulling something forward. I stumbled back, my phone slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The flashlight beam caught the shape as it emerged. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its body twisting and shifting like smoke. Its face, it didn't have a face, just a blank, pale surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, resonating silence that pressed against my ears. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My back hit the wall as it loomed over me, its head tilting as if it were studying me. And then it spoke. But it didn't use words. Its voice was inside my head, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through my skull. The meaning wasn't clear at first. like trying to remember a dream slipping away. But then the message came through, sharp and undeniable. "You don't belong here." I don't know how I managed to move, but adrenaline must have kicked in. I grabbed my phone and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. The whispers started again, muffled but persistent, like they were trying to claw their way through the walls. I didn't go back in the bedroom. I couldn't. Instead, I locked myself in the bathroom, sitting on the cold tile floor with my back to the door. I tried calling someone, anyone, but my phone had no signal. The Wi-Fi was down too. It was like the apartment had cut me off from the outside world. I thought about leaving, but the landlord's warning, the notes, the thing in the closet, I didn't know what to believe anymore. What if leaving made things worse? I stayed in the bathroom until the sun came up, every noise making me jump, every shadow making my heart race. When morning finally came, I gathered the courage to leave. Not the apartment. I wasn't ready for that yet. But I needed air. The outside world felt surreal, like I'd been underwater and just came up for air. I wandered aimlessly, not sure where to go or what to do. Finally, I ended up at the local library. It was quiet, almost empty, which was exactly what I needed. I found a computer and started searching. The Haywood Apartments didn't have much of a digital footprint, just a few reviews complaining about maintenance issues and noise. But then I found an article buried deep in the search results. It was a blog post from 2010, written by someone who claimed to have lived in the building. The author described strange experiences, hearing voices, seeing figures in the mirrors, and finding notes that seemed to appear out of nowhere. He said the building was alive, feeding off the people who lived there. His final post sent chills down my spine. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. Whatever lives here, it's not done with me. And if you're in the Haywood Apartments, it's not done with you either. Leave while you still can. I clicked on the author's profile, hoping for more answers, but it was gone. Deleted. I left the library feeling worse than before. As much as I wanted to believe it was all in my head, I couldn't ignore the patterns, the voices, the notes, the warnings. When I got back to the apartment, I noticed something immediately. The bedroom door was open, and there was a note on the floor, written in the same shaky handwriting as before. This one was different. It wasn't a warning. It was a question. Why are you still here? Before I could react, the whispering started again. This time, it wasn't just in the bedroom. It was everywhere. The whispering wrapped around me, coming from every corner of the apartment, rising and falling like it was alive. It didn't feel like sound anymore. It felt like pressure, like something was crawling beneath my skin. I stood frozen in the living room, my hands shaking as the voices grew louder, overlapping until they blurred together into a low, guttural hum. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The sound stopped instantly, leaving a silence so sharp it felt wrong. I looked around, every muscle in my body tense. The room was the same as always, same sagging couch, same dusty shelves, but the air was heavier now, charged like the seconds before a thunderstorm. And then I heard it. 3 deliberate knocks. They came from the wall behind me. Slowly I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there. But it was just the wall, plain, beige, and unremarkable. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my ears. The moment I touched it, I felt something cold, almost like the wall was breathing against my fingertips. That's when I noticed it. There was a faint outline, a square, barely visible, like a door or a panel hidden beneath the paint. The knocks came again, louder this time, and I stumbled back. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what was behind it. But the whispers started up again, this time clearer, more focused. They weren't just noise anymore. They were words. "Let us out." I grabbed a kitchen knife. Not because I thought it would help, but because holding something made me feel less helpless. Then, using the handle, I started chipping away at the wall. The paint flaked off easily, almost like it had been waiting to be removed. Beneath it was a wooden panel, dark and splintered. It looked ancient, like it didn't belong in a modern building. I pried at the edges with the knife until the panel gave way with a loud crack. Behind it was a small hollow space. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, and it smelled faintly of mildew. Inside, there was nothing except a pile of old papers and a single, rusted key. My hands trembled as I picked up the papers, flipping through them. Most of it was nonsense. Scribbles, symbols, things that didn't make any sense. But one page caught my eye. It was a drawing of the building. My building. But it wasn't the way it looked now. The drawing was old, faded, and detailed in a way that felt unsettling. There were no modern windows, no balconies, just a tall, rectangular structure with a jagged roof line. At the bottom of the page, someone had written, "This is not where it ends." I shoved the papers aside and grabbed the key. It was heavy, cold to the touch, and old enough that the metal had started to corrode. "What the hell is this for?" I muttered, turning it over in my hand. As if in response, the whispers returned. The basement. I didn't want to go. Every part of me was screaming to pack my stuff and run, to leave everything behind and never look back. But something about the whispers, about the way they seemed to crawl into my head, told me I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my bag, slipped the knife into my pocket, and made my way downstairs. The building's basement was a place I'd only been to once before. It was damp, dark, and filled with the kind of stale air that clung to your lungs. The landlord used it to store junk, old furniture, broken appliances, random odds and ends no one wanted. When I reached the door, it was already open. The stairwell was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt alive. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, using my phone's flashlight to light the way. Every step echoed, the sound bouncing off the narrow walls and fading into the abyss below. The farther I went, the colder it got, until I could see my breath in the dim light. At the bottom of the stairs, I found another door. This one was different, heavier, reinforced with iron bands that were pitted with rust. It had no handle, just a single keyhole in the center. I didn't want to use the key. I didn't even want to touch it again. But the whispers were louder now, filling the stairwell, swirling around me like a storm. "Open it." With shaking hands, I slid the key into the lock and turned. The door creaked open, revealing a long, narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were made of rough stone, damp with moisture that dripped steadily onto the floor. I stepped inside, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick, oppressive air. The hallway was lined with doors, wooden, heavy, and each one marked with a number. The numbers weren't sequential. They jumped around, some scratched out entirely, and then I saw it. Door 1976. My breath caught in my throat. That was the year from the article, the year the disappearances started. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from every direction. "Help us!" I reached for the handle, but the moment I touched it, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Slowly I pushed the door open. Inside was a room, small and empty except for a single chair in the center. Someone was sitting in it. My stomach twisted as I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminating their face. It was me. Or rather, it looked like me. Same clothes, same hair, same terrified expression frozen in place. The figure's head tilted slightly, their eyes locking onto mine. and then they smiled. Not a normal smile. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, splitting the corners of their mouth. "You're too late," they said, their voice a perfect echo of mine. The door slammed shut behind me. The sound of the door slamming reverberated through the room, leaving me in complete darkness. My phone's flashlight flickered and died, plunging everything into an impenetrable black. I stumbled backward, my hands searching for the wall, for anything solid, but all I found was empty space. "You shouldn't have come here." My own voice echoed from the chair. It wasn't just the sound of my voice. It felt like my voice, like it was coming from inside me and outside me at the same time. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The thing in the chair didn't answer. Instead, I heard the scrape of wood against the stone as it stood. The sound was wrong, heavy and deliberate, like something far bigger than me was rising to its full height. I reached into my pocket for the knife. Gripping it so tightly, my knuckles ached. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I took a step back, then another. "You let them in," the voice said, calm and even, as though it wasn't accusing me, just stating a fact. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't care. All I knew was that I needed to get out. I turned, fumbling for the door, but my hands met nothing but cold air. The room was gone, or rather it had changed. The walls, the floor, the chair. It had all been replaced by an endless void, darker than any darkness I'd ever seen. And the whispers were back, not faint now, not distant. They were all around me, loud and close, overlapping and urgent. They weren't asking for help anymore. They were screaming, "Run." I didn't hesitate. I sprinted forward, not knowing where I was going, just moving, desperate to escape the voices, the figure, the crushing emptiness that felt like it was pulling me apart. But no matter how far I ran, the whispers followed. The sound grew sharper, more frantic, until it wasn't just voices, it was footsteps, heavy, pounding footsteps, closing in on me from every direction. And then I saw it, a faint light in the distance, barely visible, but unmistakably there. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. The light grew brighter, closer, until I could make out the outline of a door. I threw myself at it, slamming my shoulder into the wood. The door burst open, and I stumbled through, collapsing onto cold, hard ground. When I looked up, I was back in my apartment. The room was quiet, eerily so. The whispers, the footsteps, the figure, everything was gone. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it all, that maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. But then I saw the chair. It was sitting in the center of my living room, the same chair from the room, now perfectly ordinary but entirely out of place. And next to it was the photo. It wasn't the one I'd found in my closet. This one was different. It showed me, standing in the hallway, staring at a door I didn't recognize. On the back, in the same shaky handwriting as before, were 2 words: "They're coming." The days that followed were a blur. I didn't leave the apartment. I barely slept, barely ate. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the void, the figure, the endless darkness. And then one night, the knocking started again. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. I didn't move. 3 more knocks. I grabbed the knife from the counter, my heart racing as I crept toward the door. When I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. But there was something on the floor. Another note. I opened the door, my hands trembling, and picked it up. This one was different, longer, written in the same jagged handwriting as before. "You can't run. You can't hide. The building isn't haunted. It's alive. and now it knows you've seen it. There's no leaving now, not for you. My stomach churned as I read the final line. You're part of it now. The whispers started again that night. They haven't stopped since. They don't just come from the walls anymore. They come from inside me, crawling through my thoughts, filling my head with words I don't understand. Sometimes I see the figure in the corner of my eye, standing in the doorway, or the reflection of a window. It never gets closer, but it doesn't have to, because the real terror isn't the figure, or the whispers, or the void. The real terror is that the apartment feels different now. The walls feel closer, the air feels heavier, and sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I can feel the building breathing around me. I don't know how much longer I have. But if you're reading this, if you live in the Haywood Apartments, leave. Don't pack your things. Don't say goodbye. Just walk out the door and don't look back. Because once the building notices you, there's no escape. It's alive and it's hungry.